police officer roughly shoved a hamburger into the mouth of a 65-year-old woman right in the middle of the diner. No one dared intervene until a former SEAL and his German Shepherd stepped in, subduing the bully in a flash. Hello, brothers of Mother Earth. I'm Wilder. Having lived half my life in the wilderness and considering animals my closest companions, I've realized a truth. Some animals possess kind hearts, while humans can sometimes be more cruel than wild beasts. That accidental act of chivalry in the Arizona desert by the former soldier revealed a heartbreaking secret about survival and abandoned dogs. Before we dive into this sandstorm, please comment below and let me know where you heard this story from. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue accompanying me on my wild adventures. The wind out here in Red Dust, Arizona doesn't just blow, it scrapes. It carries the coarse red sand across Route 66, like sandpaper against bone. It was late July, the kind of heat that makes the horizon ripple and shimmer, where the sun feels less like a star and more like a physical weight pressing down on your shoulders. Just off the cracked asphalt stood a diner, a faded, neon-lit relic of the 1980s that smelled of stale grease and black coffee. It was the kind of place people only stopped at when they had nowhere else to go, or when the desert heat forced them to seek refuge. In the far corner booth, sitting with his back to the wall, was Nash Weaver. If you looked at Nash, you saw a man who carried the heavy silence of deep water. He was in his late 30s, tall, broad-shouldered, with arms carved from years of carrying things too heavy for normal men. He wore a faded flannel shirt over a plain gray tee, his dark hair cut military short, but it was his eyes that told the real story. Stormy, calculating, scanning the room with the involuntary precision of a man who had spent a decade surviving the worst corners of the globe. Nash was a former Navy SEAL. He was a weapon trying desperately to unlearn how to be one, driving through the American Southwest in search of a quiet that seemed to constantly elude him. Resting beneath the table, perfectly still, was Koda. Koda was not a pet. He was a purebred German Shepherd, an ex-military canine who had seen just as much sand and blood as the man sitting above him. Koda's coat was a sleek mix of midnight black and deep mahogany. His ears were tall, like twin radar dishes, catching the hum of the diner's ceiling fan and the distant rumble of 18-wheelers. Koda was a master of reading energy. He knew when Nash was anxious before Nash did. He was intelligent, fiercely protective, and deeply empathetic. Right now, Koda was simply a resting soldier, enjoying the cool linoleum floor against his belly. The bell above the diner door jingled. In walked Martha Hayes. She was 65 years old, but the harsh desert life had etched another 10 years into the lines of her face. She was a widow, thin and fragile-looking, wearing a faded floral dress that had been washed too many times, and scuffed orthopedic shoes. Her silver hair was pulled back into a tight, practical bun. There was a quiet, enduring dignity about her, the kind of resilience you only find in people who have lost almost everything, but refuse to break. She clutched a crumpled brown paper bag tightly to her chest, her knuckles pale. She moved toward a small table near the counter, keeping her head down, trying to be invisible. She didn't want trouble. She just wanted a moment of air conditioning and a glass of ice water. For a few minutes, the diner was peaceful, just the clatter of silverware and the low murmur of tired travelers. Then, the door was violently thrown open. It slammed against the wall, rattling the glass. Officer Roy Vance stepped inside. The air in the room seemed to immediately curdle. Vance was a hulking man in his late 40s, his belly straining against the buttons of his tight, sweat-stained police uniform. His face was flushed red, partly from the Arizona heat, but mostly from a rage that seemed permanently simmering just beneath his skin. He smelled of cheap cologne, stale tobacco, and the intoxicating arrogance of a man who held a badge in a town with no oversight. He was a bully, a man who derived his self-worth from making others feel small. Vance's eyes scanned the room and locked onto Martha. He marched toward her with heavy, stomping boots. "You think you're smart, Martha?" Vance's voice boomed, shattering the quiet of the diner. Conversations stopped. Forks froze in midair. Every patron in the diner looked down, suddenly very interested in their plates. No one wanted to cross Roy Vance. Martha shrank back into her vinyl booth, her hands trembling as she clutched her paper bag tighter. "Officer Vance, the noise from your property. You filed a formal complaint," Vance sneered, leaning over her, his massive frame trapping the elderly woman in the corner. "Against me, in my town. You think I'm going to let some crazy old widow tell me what I can and cannot do on my own land? It was waking me up every night," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The sounds. It sounded like animals getting hurt." That struck a nerve. Vance's face twisted into an ugly, hateful mask. He wasn't just angry anymore, he was unhinged. He reached over to an abandoned table next to him, where a previous customer had left a half-eaten, greasy hamburger on a paper plate. "You need to learn to keep your mouth shut, Martha," Vance hissed. And then, in a display of cruelty so shocking it defied belief, Vance grabbed the greasy, half-eaten hamburger and violently shoved it directly into the 65-year-old woman's face. He forced it against her mouth, smearing grease, ketchup, and meat across her frail cheeks. Martha gasped, choking, flailing her thin arms as the sheer force of the assault knocked her backward. She tumbled out of the booth, hitting the hard linoleum floor with a sickening thud. The brown paper bag she was holding ripped open, scattering its contents. Nobody moved. The waitress gasped and covered her mouth. A truck driver looked away. Fear paralyzed the room. But Nash Weaver was not paralyzed. Nash moved. It wasn't a run, it was a fluid, explosive glide. 2 decades of muscle memory took over. He crossed the diner in 3 massive strides before Vance could even turn around. Vance felt the heavy, calloused hand clamp onto his shoulder. "Hey, what the—" Nash didn't speak. He didn't warn. He simply acted. With terrifying mechanical precision, Nash spun the heavy officer around, grabbed Vance's right wrist, stepped into his guard, and wrenched the arm violently behind the cop's back into a devastating hammerlock. Vance let out a strangled, high-pitched scream as the joint of his shoulder was pushed to the absolute edge of breaking. Nash drove his knee into the back of Vance's leg, forcing the massive bully to his knees right beside the counter. Nash leaned down, his face inches from Vance's ear. His voice was a deadly, quiet whisper that cut through the silence of the diner like a razor blade. "If you ever lay a hand on an old woman again, I will forget everything they taught me about mercy. Do you understand?" "You're assaulting an officer," Vance shrieked, his face pale, sweat pouring down his forehead. "I'll kill you!" Nash applied a fraction of an inch more pressure to the shoulder. Vance yelped, the threat dissolving into a whimper. "Get up," Nash commanded. He hauled Vance to his feet, marched him toward the swinging doors, and shoved him out into the blinding desert heat. "Do not come back inside." Vance stumbled into the dirt parking lot, clutching his shoulder, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and pure, venomous hatred. He scrambled into his cruiser and peeled out, kicking up a cloud of red dust. Inside the diner, the silence was thick. Nash took a deep breath, the adrenaline slowly receding, the soldier stepping back to let the man return. He turned around to check on Martha, but Koda was already there. When Martha had fallen, her paper bag had torn. From where Koda sat across the room, the scent had hit him instantly. Koda had been trained to detect explosives, narcotics, and the stress hormones of human beings. But as he trotted over to the frail woman on the floor, his incredibly sensitive nose picked up something specific from her torn bag and her clothing. He smelled dried blood. And beneath that, the sharp, distinct chemical odor of heavy-duty veterinary antibiotics and antiseptic spray. Koda was a dog who had spent his life surrounded by the wounded. He knew what care smelled like. He knew what trauma smelled like. He looked at Martha, sensing her racing heartbeat, her terror, her humiliation. Koda did not bark. He did not act aggressively. Instead, the 80-pound German Shepherd stepped gently over the spilled contents of her bag. He lowered his massive, scarred head and softly rested his warm snout right onto Martha's trembling thigh. He let out a low, comforting breath. Martha, still shaking, looked down at the imposing military dog. The fear in her eyes slowly melted. With a trembling, grease-stained hand, she reached out and stroked the soft fur behind Koda's ears. Nash walked over and knelt beside her, offering his hand to help her up. He looked at Koda, then at the old woman, and he knew instantly that his search for peace in this desert town had just ended. He hadn't just protected a stranger, he had just walked into a war. If you spend enough time in the untamed spaces of this world, you learn a fundamental truth. The desert does not easily forgive, but it surely knows how to keep a secret. Out here, beyond the cracked asphalt veins of the highway, the land swallows truths whole. After the dust settled at the diner, Nash Weaver knew he couldn't simply drive away. The look in Officer Roy Vance's eyes wasn't just wounded pride. It was the venom of a cornered rattlesnake. Vance would retaliate, and a frail 65-year-old widow would be the easiest target. Nash gently guided Martha out of the diner and into the blinding afternoon sun. She was trembling, her fragile fingers clutching the torn brown paper bag against her chest like a shield. "I can take you home, ma'am," Nash offered, his voice a low, steady rumble that contrasted with the harsh Arizona wind. "Vance won't let this go, and you shouldn't be out here alone." Martha hesitated. Her eyes darted toward her old, rusted pickup truck, parked in the dirt lot, then up to Nash, and finally to Koda. The German Shepherd stood faithfully by Nash's side, a silent sentinel radiating absolute calm. "You shouldn't get involved, son," Martha whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears and a deep-seated terror. "You don't know what kind of town this is. You don't know what I'm hiding. If you come with me, you cross a line you can't uncross." But Nash was driven by a primal instinct to shield the weak, a remnant of his Navy SEAL days that no amount of desert sun could ever burn away. He simply opened the passenger door of his sturdy, dust-covered Chevy Tahoe. "I know a bully when I see one, Martha, and my dog seems to think you're worth looking after." With a weary, trembling sigh, the old woman climbed in. Koda hopped effortlessly into the back seat, immediately poking his massive head between the front seats to keep a watchful, comforting eye on her. The drive to the very edge of red dust was shrouded in a heavy silence, save for the low hum of the engine and the crunch of dry gravel. The dilapidated town quickly gave way to desolate scrubland, where twisted mesquite trees clawed at the vast, empty sky like desperate fingers. Eventually, Martha's property came into view. It sat at the end of a long, unmarked dirt road, a weather-beaten farm, surrounded by sagging wire fences and dominated by a large, rusted, corrugated tin barn that looked as though it had been standing there since the 1950s. The very moment the truck's engine cut off, Koda's posture transformed. His tall ears swiveled sharply forward. The thick hair along his spine stood straight up. It wasn't aggression. It was absolute, laser-focused recognition. He let out a sharp, resonant bark, his amber eyes locked entirely on the old tin barn. He leapt from the truck the second Nash opened the door, pulling toward the structure with urgent purpose. Nash stepped out, his tactical instincts instantly flaring to life. "What is it, buddy?" he asked, scanning the perimeter. Martha scrambled out of the truck, her face suddenly pale with absolute terror. "No, please!" she cried out, grabbing Nash's sleeve with surprising, desperate strength. "Don't go in there. If Vance finds out you've seen it, he'll kill us both. Let it be, please. Just drive away." Her desire to protect this kind stranger was powerful, but Nash's need to understand the battlefield he had just walked into was far stronger. He gently, but firmly, removed her hand from his arm. "Martha, if I'm going to protect you, I need to know exactly what I'm protecting you from." Nash walked toward the heavy barn doors, Koda leading the way with his nose pressed to the hard dirt. He grabbed the handle and slid the creaking metal door open on its rusted track. The heat inside was stifling, almost suffocating, but it was heavily masked by a distinct cocktail of odors: pungent veterinary iodine, bleach, and something metallic, the unmistakable scent of old blood. As his eyes adjusted to the dim, dusty light filtering through the rusted holes in the roof, Nash stopped dead in his tracks. Lined up carefully along the interior walls were 5 large, custom-built chain-link enclosures. Inside them were not farm animals, but dogs. Specifically, Belgian Malinois and German Shepherds, the elite, highly trained warriors of the canine world. But these were not proud, standing soldiers. They were broken. In the first pen lay a Malinois missing a front leg, his fawn coat dull and patchy. In another, a massive black shepherd with terrible, jagged burn scars across his flank cowered in the shadows. Martha had been quietly running an underground hospice for discarded, severely injured canines, military and police dogs that had been written off by the system as acceptable collateral damage. But it was the enclosure at the very back of the barn that drew Koda. The black shepherd trotted over and let out a soft, heartbreaking whine. Nash approached slowly, his boots silent on the concrete. Inside, huddled in the darkest corner, was a dog that made Nash's breath catch in his throat. It was a large, sable-coated German shepherd, roughly 6 years old. He should have been a magnificent, powerful specimen of his breed, but he was skeletal, his ribs protruding sharply against his matted fur. A deep, jagged scar ran across his snout, and his left ear was torn in half. But the worst part was his eyes. They were wide, frantic, and completely devoid of the courageous light that defines a working canine. He trembled violently as Nash approached, pressing himself so hard against the chain link that the metal rattled. Martha stepped into the barn behind Nash, her shoulders finally slumping in total defeat. "His name is Rex," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of profound sadness and simmering anger. Nash turned to her, the pieces of the dark puzzle finally snapping together in his mind. "The police department?" Martha nodded, tears spilling over her weathered cheeks, cutting trails through the dust on her face. Rex was Officer Vance's partner. 2 years ago, they botched a drug raid. Rex took a bullet and a brutal beating that was meant for Vance. He saved that monster's life, but instead of getting him care, Vance tossed him in a dumpster behind a clinic to bleed out. He said a broken tool wasn't worth the vet bill. She wiped her face, her eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce defiance. I found him. I patched him up. I've been patching them all up. But Vance has a new, dark operation now, and if he knows I kept his dog alive, he won't just hurt me. He'll finish the job on all of them. Nash looked back at Rex. The abused, terrified dog was staring intently at Koda. Koda, the confident, healthy veteran, did not bark. He did not assert dominance. Instead, he slowly lay down on the concrete floor just outside Rex's cage. He lowered his chin to his paws, letting out a long, calm breath, speaking the silent, ancient language of brotherhood. You are safe. I am here. Watching the two dogs, Nash felt a cold, hard knot of resolve form in his chest. He had come to the desert looking for peace, but as he looked at the frail widow and the broken soldiers she protected, he realized the war wasn't over. It had just been waiting for him. Welcome back to the fire, my friends. I am Wilder. Out here in the vast, open expanses of the desert, we say that the night does not bring peace. It only changes the kind of hunters that roam. When the brutal Arizona sun finally dips below the horizon, the temperature plummets and the shadows stretch long and deep across the red dirt. Inside Martha's rusted tin barn, the heat of the day gave way to a biting chill. The air was thick with the scent of fear and old wounds, but in the dim light of a single hanging bulb, a silent, beautiful conversation was taking place, one that required no human words. Koda, the magnificent black and mahogany German shepherd, stood near the center of the barn. He had not eaten his dinner. Instead, he gently clamped his strong jaws around the rim of his aluminum food bowl, which was filled with high-protein kibble. With slow, deliberate steps, he walked toward the enclosure at the very back, where Rex remained huddled in the darkest corner. Rex, the shattered former police canine, trembled violently as Koda approached. His torn ear twitched, and his eyes darted around, anticipating violence. He had learned the hard way that other dogs, especially in the presence of his former master, meant pain. But Koda was speaking the ancient, instinctual language of the pack, rooted in deep compassion rather than dominance. He did not puff out his chest. He did not make direct eye contact, which in the dog world is a challenge. Instead, Koda lowered his head, licked his own lips, a classic canine calming signal, and let out a soft, non-threatening sigh. He slid the metal bowl under the small gap at the bottom of the chain-link gate. Then, Koda did something extraordinary. He turned his back to Rex and lay down on the cold concrete floor, exposing his vulnerable spine. It was the ultimate gesture of trust. I am not a threat. We are brothers of the same blood. For a long time, the only sound was the howling of the desert wind outside. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, Rex crept forward. His nose twitched. The smell of the food was overpowering, but the presence of the calm, steadfast dog sitting guard was what truly drew him out. Rex lowered his scarred snout to the bowl and began to eat, his trembling gradually subsiding. Koda didn't move a muscle, simply serving as a silent, protective shield. In the wild, fear only transforms into belief when compassion overrides the primal instinct to survive alone. Tonight, a broken warrior was taking his very first steps back toward the light. The quiet sanctuary of the barn was violently shattered. The harsh crunch of heavy tires tearing up gravel echoed outside, followed immediately by the blinding, high-beam glare of police spotlights piercing through the gaps in the tin walls. The sudden intrusion sent the injured dogs into a chorus of panicked whimpers and frantic barking. Nash Weaver, whose Navy SEAL instincts never truly slept, instantly pressed his back against the cool metal wall, fading completely into the shadows. He signaled Koda with a sharp, silent hand gesture. The dog immediately went prone, quiet and invisible. Outside, the heavy doors of a police cruiser slammed shut. Officer Roy Vance had not come alone. He was flanked by two men, his loyal deputies, who enforced his corrupt will upon red dust. On his left was Deputy Miller. Miller was in his late 20s, wiry and twitchy, moving with the restless, nervous energy of a coyote scavenging for scraps. He had a thin, weasel-like face, constantly chewing tobacco, and a desperate, pathetic need to impress Vance. He was a man with no moral compass, willing to do whatever dirty work kept him in power. On Vance's right was Deputy Stokes. Stokes was entirely different, a heavily built man in his 50s, with a thick, graying beard and apathetic, dead eyes. He looked like a man who had given up on the concept of justice decades ago, and now simply followed the money. He moved slowly, his hand resting lazily on his holstered weapon. "Hey, hero!" Vance's voice boomed through a megaphone, the metallic amplification echoing across the desolate farm. "I know you're in there, Weaver. You think you can waltz into my town? Assault a police officer and hide behind an old widow's skirt? Nash didn't say a word. He held his breath, watching through a rusted bullet hole in the siding. He kept one hand firmly on Martha's shoulder, keeping her safely crouched behind a stack of hay bales. Miller stepped forward, picking up a rock the size of a baseball. With a manic grin, he hurled it. The rock struck the corrugated tin roof with a deafening crack that sounded like a gunshot. The dogs inside screamed in terror. "You've got until sunrise to pack your bags and leave red dust," Vance yelled, his voice dripping with malice. "If I see your truck tomorrow, you're going in a cell for assaulting an officer. And trust me, accidents happen in my jail. As for you, Martha, I'm calling animal control in the morning to condemn this biohazard you call a barn." Vance spat on the ground, turned on his heel, and the three men climbed back into the cruiser. They peeled out, leaving behind a choking cloud of dust and the menacing red glow of their taillights fading into the desert night. Martha was weeping silently, her hands covering her face. "They're going to take them, Nash. They're going to kill my dogs." Nash stepped out of the shadows, his jaw set like carved granite. He didn't run to the door to shout back. He was a tactician. He walked over to Rex's cage and retrieved a small flashlight from his pocket, clicking it on its dimmest setting. "Martha," Nash said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Why did Vance really want Rex dead?" "I told you," she sobbed. "He was injured in a raid." "No," Nash interrupted gently, stepping inside the enclosure and shining the light over Rex's scarred body. "I've seen gunshot wounds. I've seen blunt force trauma. That's not what this is." Nash's trained eyes scanned the specific patterns of the terrible wounds on Rex, and then he moved to the neighboring pens to examine the torn flanks and shredded ears of the other discarded canines. The wounds were systematic. They were puncture marks, deep lacerations, and crushing injuries to the neck and legs. "These are bite marks," Nash whispered, the horrific truth dawning on him. He looked down and noticed a heavy, blood-stained leather collar hanging on a nail near Martha's medical supplies. A collar far too thick for standard police work, lined with metal studs, the kind used exclusively to protect the jugular in illegal fighting rings. Nash looked at Martha, his eyes hardening into flint. Vance wasn't just discarding broken tools. He was running a highly organized, illegal, underground dog-fighting ring. The corrupt cop was taking retired or injured military and police dogs, creatures trained to protect and serve, and throwing them into bloody fighting pits to be used as bait or gladiators for high-stakes gambling. Vance wasn't trying to scare Nash away because of a bruised ego over a hamburger. He was trying to scare Nash away because Nash was standing directly on top of the evidence that could put the entire corrupt police force in federal prison. Nash turned off his flashlight. The desert night was dark, but the fire in the ex-SEAL's eyes burned brighter than a flare. He wasn't leaving at sunrise. He was going to war. Out here in the vast, unforgiving expanses of the American Southwest, we have an old saying about the predators that roam the canyons. Running only makes you prey. When a mountain lion or a pack of coyotes catches your scent, turning your back is an invitation to be hunted. The only way to survive a predator that has marked you is to stand your ground, make yourself larger than your fear, and stare right back into the darkness. Inside the dimly lit, rusted tin barn, the dust had settled after Officer Vance's menacing departure, but the heavy, suffocating weight of his threat lingered in the freezing night air. Martha Hayes sat on an overturned wooden crate, her fragile frame trembling like a dry leaf caught in a winter gale. She was terrified, clutching her worn shawl tightly around her shoulders, mentally preparing to pack whatever she could carry and flee into the desert. But Nash Weaver, leaning against the chain-link enclosure with the quiet, immovable stillness of a mountain, had a different plan. He knew that corrupt men like Vance thrived on the fear they instilled. To run was to give Vance exactly what he wanted, allowing the darkness to win and leaving the dogs to a gruesome fate. "Martha, look at me," Nash said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the swirling storm of her panic. "If we run, he hunts us down. He has the badge, the radios, the roads. Hiding will only embolden them to cross lines they haven't crossed yet. We are not leaving. We are going to dig our heels into this red dirt and fight back." Martha looked up, her eyes wide, swimming with tears of sheer exhaustion and despair. The dam she had built to hold back her grief finally shattered. With a ragged, heart-wrenching sob, she buried her face in her hands, the truth pouring out of her in a broken whisper. "You don't understand why I do this, Nash. I didn't ask for this war. I couldn't let them die alone in the dirt." She wiped her eyes, looking past Nash into the shadows of the barn. "My son, Elias, that was his name. As Martha spoke, the image of a young man materialized in the heavy air of the barn. Elias Hayes had been 22 years old, a tall, lanky kid with a smile that could outshine the Arizona sun, and a stubborn streak a mile wide. He had joined the Marines, finding his true calling as a canine handler in the dusty, explosive-laden valleys of Afghanistan. He had loved his dog, a bomb-sniffing Labrador named Buster, more than life itself. Elias didn't make it back, Martha whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of a mother's eternal grief. An IED took him. His commanding officer told me that in his final moments, Elias covered Buster with his own body. He gave his life to protect his partner. She gestured with a trembling hand toward the cages filled with the scarred, broken military and police dogs. When I look at them, I see Elias. I see the brothers in arms he died for. The system used these dogs up, broke their bodies, and threw them away like garbage. I couldn't save my boy, Nash, but I promised God I would save them. I can't leave them behind to be slaughtered. The profound sorrow in her confession settled over the barn, but instead of bringing despair, it ignited a spark. Nash stepped forward, kneeling in the dirt before the old woman, and gently took her weathered hands in his calloused ones. "Then we don't leave them," he said, the icy resolve of a Navy SEAL cementing in his eyes. "We build a case so bulletproof that the state troopers will have to arrest Vance before the sun sets tomorrow. But to do that, we need hard evidence. Rumors and bite marks aren't enough to take down a cop." Nash quickly formulated a tactical plan. He knew that high-level working canines were implanted with specialized microchips, not just for identification, but advanced RFID tags that sometimes logged encrypted GPS checkpoints for military and police tracking. "Do you have a veterinary scanner?" Nash asked. Martha nodded, wiping her tears, and retrieved a handheld device from her medical kit. Nash approached Rex's enclosure. The scarred German shepherd flinched, but Koda was already there. Koda, the magnificent black and mahogany warrior, had not moved from his protective stance. As Nash reached through the fence with the scanner, Koda let out a soft, reassuring boof, a low, chest-deep sound of encouragement. Rex held perfectly still. The scanner beeped. Nash connected the device to his heavily encrypted military-grade smartphone, his fingers flying across the screen as he bypassed the local precinct's security firewalls. "Got it," Nash muttered, a grim smile touching his lips. The chip logged GPS coordinates every time Vance's cruiser synced with it. It shows a clear pattern leading to an abandoned warehouse out on Route 9, the fighting pits. But we need to tie Vance directly to the transport. Nash looked toward the barn doors. Vance is arrogant. He thinks he's untouchable. He won't have wiped the dashcam footage from his cruiser yet. I'm going to slip into town, breach his vehicle, and clone that SD card. You stay here, lock the doors, and keep the dogs quiet. But as Nash turned to leave, something miraculous happened in the shadows of the rusted barn. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of victimhood began to evaporate, replaced by an ancient, primal courage. It started with Koda. The former military dog stood up, his posture tall, proud, and radiating an unshakable alpha energy. He did not growl, but he let out a sharp, commanding bark that echoed off the tin roof. It was a call to arms. Inside the darkest cage, Rex, the dog who had spent weeks cowering and trembling at the sound of his own shadow, slowly rose to his feet. His torn ear twitched. He stepped out of the darkness, walking right up to the chain-link fence, standing shoulder to shoulder with Koda. In the next pen, the Belgian Malinois missing a front leg struggled upright, balancing perfectly on his remaining limbs, his eyes burning with sudden clarity. One by one, the 5 broken, discarded canines stood up. They stopped whining. They stopped hiding in the corners. Led by Koda's fearless example, they let out a unified, resonant chorus of barks. Not cries of fear, but a symphony of absolute defiance. They were no longer victims waiting for the slaughter. They had remembered who they were. They were warriors, and they were ready to defend their home. Nash looked at the dogs, then at Martha, who was staring at the magnificent animals with fresh tears, this time of profound awe. The ex-SEAL checked the magazine of his sidearm, pulling his jacket tight against the desert chill. The fear was gone. The hunt had begun. Out here, under the vast canopy of the Arizona sky, the moon sometimes rises heavy and stained with the color of rust. The old ones used to say a blood moon is nature's way of holding its breath, a silent warning that the earth is about to witness the collision of predators. Nash Weaver had just tightened the laces on his combat boots, preparing to slip into the desert night and retrieve the dashcam evidence from town, when the steady, comforting hum of Martha's ancient diesel generator abruptly choked and died. In a single heartbeat, the rusted tin barn and the surrounding farmhouse were plunged into an ink-black, suffocating darkness. The solitary bulb overhead flickered and faded to nothing. The crickets in the scrub brush went dead silent. Nash's blood turned to ice water, his Navy SEAL instincts instantly hijacking his civilian mind. Officer Roy Vance was not a patient man. Whether his paranoia had gotten the best of him, or the corrupt precinct's network had pinged an alert when Nash scanned the microchip, Vance had decided that waiting for sunrise was a fool's game. He had come to the farm to wipe the slate clean, to bury his sins under the desert sand by silencing Nash, Martha, and the discarded canines forever. "Martha, get down and stay behind the feed troughs," Nash whispered, his voice a razor-sharp thread in the pitch black. He unholstered his sidearm, his eyes already adjusting to the faint crimson moonlight spilling through the cracks in the tin roof. "Keep the dogs quiet. Do not move until I tell you to." Nash slipped out the side door of the barn, like a ghost exhaling into the wind. The desert air was freezing, biting at his skin. As he merged with the shadows of the abandoned tractor graveyard in the front yard, he spotted them. 3 figures moving with tactical, albeit sloppy, precision. Vance, Miller, and Stokes. They carried heavy, matte black shotguns, the unmistakable silhouettes of men who had come to execute, not to arrest. Nash knew he could not engage them in a straight firefight. The stray bullets could penetrate the thin tin walls and hit Martha or the dogs. He had to use the darkness, turning the farm into a hunting ground where he was the apex predator. He tracked Deputy Stokes first. Stokes, the heavily built, apathetic man with the graying beard, was moving slowly toward the back porch of the farmhouse, his boots crunching loudly on the dry gravel. Nash flanked him, using the rusted husk of an old water tower for cover. As Stokes rounded the corner, raising his weapon to peer into a window, Nash struck. With terrifying, silent speed, the former SEAL clamped one hand over Stokes's mouth and the other around his throat in a flawless, blood-choking submission hold. Stokes thrashed wildly, his heavy boots kicking up dust, but Nash dragged him backward into the shadows. Within 10 seconds, Stokes went completely limp, unconscious before he even knew what had grabbed him. Nash swiftly disarmed the man and secured his wrists with heavy-duty zip ties pulled from his tactical belt. On the other side of the yard, Deputy Miller, the twitchy, weasel-faced enforcer, was sweeping the perimeter near the chicken coops. Miller was breathing heavily, terrified of the dark, chewing his tobacco with frantic, erratic jaw movements. Nash picked up a heavy, rusted wrench from the dirt and tossed it against the side of the metal silo. Clang! Miller spun around, his shotgun raised, his flashlight beam slicing through the dark. "Who's there?" Miller stammered, his voice cracking. As Miller crept toward the silo, Nash dropped from the low branch of an overhanging mesquite tree directly behind him. A swift, devastating strike behind Miller's knees sent the deputy crashing to the ground, followed by a precise, heavy blow to the solar plexus that knocked the wind completely out of his lungs. Nash stripped him of his weapon, bound him, and left him gasping in the dirt. But as Nash secured the second deputy, the sickening, metallic crash of a door being kicked off its hinges echoed from the barn. Vance had bypassed the house entirely. He knew where the real evidence was. Inside the barn, Martha screamed. Vance stood in the doorway, bathed in the eerie red light of the blood moon, a customized tactical shotgun leveled directly at the cages. His face was twisted into a grotesque mask of sheer, unadulterated hatred. He racked the pump of the shotgun, the metallic clack-clack, echoing like a death knell. "Time to put the broken toys out of their misery," Vance snarled, aiming the barrel directly at Rex, the scarred German shepherd who had once taken a bullet for him. Before Vance's finger could even touch the trigger, a blur of midnight black and deep mahogany launched through the air. Koda did not bark. He did not offer a warning. The 80-pound military canine hit Vance square in the chest like a guided missile. Vance let out a breathless scream as the sheer kinetic force of the dog knocked him backward, the shotgun discharging harmlessly into the tin roof with a deafening roar. Koda's powerful jaws clamped down on Vance's forearm, his teeth sinking deep into the corrupt officer's flesh, pinning the weapon arm to the concrete floor. Vance thrashed violently, using his free hand to punch wildly at Koda's ribs, desperate to shake the magnificent dog off. "Get off me, you mutt!" Vance roared, his eyes wide with panic as he managed to reach for a hunting knife strapped to his belt. Martha watched, paralyzed by terror, as the blade gleamed in the dim light. She let out a desperate, tearful plea. "No! Leave him alone!" It was the sound of her voice, the voice of the woman who had washed their wounds, who had fed them by hand, who had loved them when the world threw them away, that shattered the final barrier of fear in the darkness. Inside the enclosure, Rex's eyes snapped open. The trauma, the beatings, the weeks of cowering in the shadows simply evaporated. He was no longer a victim. He was a canine, and his handler was in danger. With a guttural, terrifying roar, Rex threw his entire body weight against the chain-link gate. The rusted latch, already weakened by age, snapped. Rex exploded out of the cage, lunging directly at his former abuser. His jaws clamped fiercely onto Vance's other arm, halting the knife mid-swing. But Rex was not alone. Behind him, the barn erupted in a symphony of glorious, primal vengeance. The three-legged Belgian Malinois hobbled forward with impossible speed, diving to clamp his teeth onto Vance's heavy leather boot. The massive black shepherd with the burn scars hurled himself into the fray, seizing the fabric of Vance's pant leg and tearing it to shreds. The 5 broken, discarded souls that Vance had tortured and thrown away did not attack like feral, mindless beasts. They attacked like a disciplined, unified pack defending their matriarch. They pinned the massive, corrupt cop entirely to the ground, their growls vibrating through the concrete, their jaws locked in an unbreakable grip of protective fury. Vance screamed, dropping his knife, completely overwhelmed, paralyzed by the overwhelming force of the very creatures he had deemed worthless. The barn doors flew open wide. Nash Weaver stood in the threshold, his flashlight cutting through the dust, his sidearm drawn and steady. He looked at the scene before him, the corrupt tyrant writhing on the floor, weeping in terror, pinned beneath a blanket of scarred, beautiful warriors, while Koda stood proudly at the helm. Nash lowered his weapon, a profound sense of awe washing over him. The old woman's pure, unwavering compassion had not just healed their bodies, it had resurrected their spirits. Fear had been permanently replaced by belief. Nash looked at Martha, who was crying tears of pure, overwhelming gratitude, and then back to the dogs. The battle was over. The wild had won.
Vance, you're under arrest.
Out here in the vast, untamed stretches of the desert, we know that no matter how terrifying the storm or how suffocating the darkness, the sun always rises. The earth does not hold on to its nightmares forever. It washes them away with the pale gold of dawn. As the rusted tin barn settled into a profound, exhausted quiet, the heavy lifting of justice was just beginning. Nash Weaver, his breathing steady and his eyes sharp, stepped over the trembling, whimpering form of Officer Roy Vance. The corrupt cop, completely broken by the overwhelming force of the very animals he had abused, was securely zip-tied to a heavy iron support beam alongside his deputies, Miller and Stokes. Nash retrieved his heavily encrypted military-grade smartphone from his tactical vest. During the entire horrifying confrontation, Nash's device had been quietly recording audio, capturing every single malicious threat, every admission of guilt, and every terrifying promise Vance had made in the dark. Combined with the encrypted GPS coordinates extracted from Rex's microchip, a digital trail of breadcrumbs leading directly to the illegal dogfighting rings, Nash had compiled a bulletproof dossier. He did not call the local precinct. That would have been a fatal error. Instead, bypassing the compromised local network entirely, Nash transmitted the data packet directly to the highest echelon of the Arizona State Troopers and the federal authorities. The trap had been sprung, and the message was sent. All they had to do now was wait for the light. The desert sky began to bleed from bruised purple into a brilliant, fiery orange. The silence of the morning was suddenly shattered by the rhythmic, deafening thwup 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 of heavy rotor blades cutting through the crisp air. Martha Hayes walked out onto her front porch, pulling her worn shawl tight around her shoulders, her weary eyes widening in absolute awe. Cresting the red dunes were 2 dark, sleek state police helicopters, kicking up massive clouds of dust as they descended upon the farm. Simultaneously, a convoy of highly armored black SUVs and marked state trooper cruisers tore down the dirt road, their red and blue lights flashing brilliantly against the rising sun, completely surrounding the perimeter. From the lead SUV stepped Captain James Caldwell. Caldwell was a man who commanded the very ground he walked on. He was in his late 50s, tall and broad-chested, wearing a crisp, immaculate tan uniform that contrasted sharply with the chaotic dust of the farm. He had a closely cropped silver beard, deeply weathered skin, and piercing steel-gray eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Caldwell was legendary within the state forces for his unwavering, ironclad integrity. He was a man who despised dirty cops more than the lowest criminals, viewing them as a rot that tarnished the sacred badge he had dedicated his life to. Captain Caldwell strode into the barn, taking in the sight of the bloodied, bound local deputies and the defiant, proud canine standing guard. He looked at Nash, recognizing the quiet, lethal discipline of a fellow military man, and gave a brief, respectful nod. Caldwell then turned his chilling gaze down to Vance. "Roy Vance!" Caldwell's voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that echoed with finality. "You are an absolute disgrace to that uniform. You're done." As the state troopers hauled Vance and his cronies away in heavy iron cuffs, Martha fell to her knees, burying her face in Koda's thick, dark fur, weeping tears of pure, unadulterated relief. The nightmare was finally over. The scales of justice had been forcefully balanced. But the sunrise that morning brought more than just justice. It brought the eyes of the entire world. Within 48 hours, the story exploded. What began as a localized arrest transformed into a monumental national news phenomenon. The major broadcast networks, gripping newspapers, and viral online platforms could not get enough of the incredible tale. A widowed mother honoring her fallen Marine son, a stoic former Navy SEAL seeking peace, and a pack of shattered, discarded military dogs who rose up to defend the woman who loved them. The narrative struck a deep, resonant chord across the country. Almost overnight, an overwhelming tidal wave of compassion swept over the desolate Arizona town. Massive crowdfunding campaigns were launched, and private donations from veterans organizations, animal welfare groups, and thousands of ordinary, deeply moved citizens began flooding in. The dilapidated, rusted tin barn and the sagging wire fences were systematically torn down, replaced by something magnificent. In their place rose the newly christened Elias Hayes K9 Sanctuary. It was a state-of-the-art facility featuring climate-controlled kennels, vast grassy play enclosures, an advanced physical therapy pool for amputee dogs, and an on-site veterinary clinic. Martha Hayes, once a lonely, terrified widow hiding in the shadows of the desert, was now the proud, beaming matriarch of a recognized, fully funded rehabilitation center, a beacon of hope for every working dog that the system tried to leave behind. Nash Weaver stood on the wide wooden porch of the newly renovated farmhouse, a steaming mug of black coffee in his hand. For the first time in over a decade, the restless, burning urge to pack his duffel bag and keep driving had completely vanished. He had spent years wandering the globe, searching the empty corners of the world for a silence that could cure the ghosts of his past. But looking out over the sanctuary, watching Martha laugh as she tossed a tennis ball for the three-legged Malinois, Nash finally understood. Peace is not found in the absence of noise. It is found in the presence of purpose. He had found his mission. He had found a family. Nash decided, without a shadow of a doubt, that he was staying in red dust. As the blazing Arizona sun began its slow, majestic descent, painting the boundless desert sky in breathtaking strokes of violet, crimson, and gold, Nash set his coffee down. Out on the sprawling, fenced-in dunes, two magnificent silhouettes were moving. Koda, the sleek, mahogany and black protector, and Rex, the scarred but beautifully unbroken survivor. They were not patrolling. They were not fighting. They were simply running. Their powerful strides matched in perfect, joyful synchronization, kicking up plumes of red dust into the evening air. Rex's torn ear flapped in the wind, his eyes no longer clouded by terror, but shining with the fierce, wild light of a creature who had remembered his own strength. They ran together under the blood-orange sunset, free, proud, and undeniably alive, proving to the world that no matter how broken a spirit may be, love and courage can always lead it home. Friends, as the dust settles on this story, there is a quiet truth we can all carry back to our own lives. We often see the world through the lens of survival, believing that the broken things must be left behind. But Martha and these incredible dogs teach us something far older and deeper. True strength is not found in how hard we can fight, but in how deeply we can care. In our everyday lives, we may not face corrupt men in the desert, but we do cross paths with wounded souls. A neighbor, a friend, or even a stray animal might cross our path. Sometimes people build walls of anger or fear simply because life has been cruel to them. If we can offer them just a fraction of the patience Koda showed Rex, or the unwavering love Martha gave to those she saved, we might just help them remember their own courage. Healing does not always require grand gestures. Often, it just requires someone willing to sit in the dark with you until the dawn arrives. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a reminder that hope still exists. Leave a comment below and let me know your thoughts. And please subscribe to the channel so we can continue to walk these trails together. May God bless you, your families, and the innocent creatures you care for. If you believe in the healing power of compassion, please write Amen in the comments below. Walk gently upon the earth, until we meet again.